Altered Beast is a game with a polarizing reputation. On the one hand, you have those who grew up with it. They played it when it first released in 1988 in arcades and 1989 for the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive. These people tend to hold it in high regard. They have fond memories of it and appreciate its simple yet addictive arcade-style gameplay. On the other hand, you have those who only got around to playing Altered Beast when its time in the sun had passed. These people view the game in a much harsher light. They wonder how it could have garnered so much love and affection back in the day, considering how repetitious and boring the core gameplay is. To them, it seems like an outdated game, one that is a relic of the arcade heyday that just doesn't hold up today. It would be much better, they argue, to leave it in the past where it belongs. I'm coming off of my first time ever playing Altered Beast. The Sega Genesis was my first console. It's the one that got me into video games, and I'll always love and appreciate it for that. But it predates me by about 7 years. It released in North America in 1989, and I released in North America in 1996. By this time, the Saturn had already replaced the Genesis as Sega's new console. I didn't have a disposable income as an infant, so the only games I got were from Christmas and such. Sonic 1 and NHL 94 were the only ones I sunk any considerable amount of time into, but man, I love those games. By the time the 2000s came around, I was fully into the Dreamcast and GameCube. The idea that criticism of Altered Beast is a modern phenomenon isn't true, despite what some early adopters of the Genesis might tell you. The game was met with mixed reception upon its release in arcades in 1988, especially in Japan. But it is true that it did manage to catch sizable traction in Europe and North America. This is what drove Sega to release it as a launch title for the Genesis/Mega Drive in the West. In fact, it was the first pack-in game for the console, the one that came bundled with the system. It held on to that role for 2 years until the first Sonic game relieved it of duty in 1991. The game features the vile Neph, a ruler from the ancient Greek underworld who kidnaps Zeus's daughter Athena. In response, Zeus resurrects a dead warrior and promises him freedom in return for Athena's rescue. In the arcade original, the plot turns out to be an in-game movie and concludes with the cast getting some beers after wrapping up. That's awesome, man. That's vintage Sega right there. The game revolves around the beast transformations. In each level, the warrior can obtain a power-up called a Spirit Orb. Collect 3 in a row and he will transform into that level's beast. Credit where credit's due. These transformations are awesome and the theme that kicks in is badass. And of course, the beasts themselves are pretty overpowered, especially when compared to the normal stage enemies. It very much feels like going into beast mode. The presentation is another thing I can appreciate. Of course, turning into the beast is the highlight, but even the sprites, base character models, boss designs, and backgrounds are pretty pleasant, at least for a game from 1988. I mean, Ronald Reagan was still president of the United States at the time. Let that sink in.
Just show you how youthful I am, I intend to campaign in all 13 states.
And how could I forget the in-game sound clips? They're iconic and awesome and give the game a fair amount of charm. Don't take my word for it though, have a listen for yourself.
Light from your blade. Power up. Welcome to your doom.
This is made more impressive because what you're seeing is a console port of an arcade game. Nowadays, that may not seem like a big deal, but it was a huge selling point in the late 80s and early 90s. Altered Beast was converted to the Genesis mere months after its initial release in arcades, and it was a very faithful port with only a few graphical niceties being absent. That was unheard of back then. Most of the arcade to home console ports were highly compromised versions of the source material, if not different games entirely. But that was then, and this is now. What might have been impressive then isn't anymore. Altered Beast has been resoundingly and mercilessly criticized by modern gamers for its repetition. Gameplay boils down to walking up to an enemy, mashing one of 2 melee buttons, punch or kick, and moving on to the next enemy to repeat the same steps. Levels are never any different. You'll always be walking down the same paths, and enemies will always appear from the same locations. Often this has the effect of rewarding rote memorization as opposed to skill mastery. It makes the game a tiring experience, one that can and probably will cause fatigue after playing for any prolonged period of time. Altered Beast attempts to address its repetition problem in 2 ways. First, the beasts. They inject a much needed dose of variety and flavor to an otherwise stale experience. They come with their own unique attacks and abilities. My favorite is the Werebear because of his ability to Cryofreeze enemies. This has the effect of blocking and counteracting enemy movements. It's a lifesaver in the higher difficulties because it can prevent you from being overwhelmed. Believe me, you do not want this to happen. It's essentially a game over regardless of health. But Beast's gameplay isn't without its problems. The bosses, aside from the first one, are pretty boring. The second one can be defeated in a matter of seconds if you position the Were-Dragon correctly.
Welcome to your doom.
The third one can be melted by spamming the spin jump, and the final 2 encounters can be finished by crouching and firing your projectile. Sure, Neff can occasionally inflict damage while you're down there, but it's not a serious threat if you have enough health. Furthermore, if players get good enough, and chances are they will after just a few playthroughs because levels always stay the same, they'll get all 3 spirit ores before reaching the first checkpoint. This means they'll only get to play as the beast for the lackluster boss fights. The second way Altered Beast tries to remedy its repetition problem is through the difficulty modes. If you press and hold the kick button and press the start button at the title screen, you'll bring up the in-game menu. Here you can mess around with modifiers including health and lives. It allows you to fine-tune the experience to your liking, making the game more difficult or more forgiving. I think this is great because it makes this more accessible to novice players or those looking for a more casual experience. Not everyone wants to play a game that occasionally makes them want to slam their controller into the ground. It's also in this menu where you can access one of 3 difficulty modes, normal, hard, or hardest. They try to shake things up by adding more enemies on screen. It was indeed enough to incentivize me to come back after my first complete run, so take that as you will. I wanted to see how things would change, what enemies would be added. In some cases it does change things substantially, but in others not so much. The bosses are the worst hit with these changes, or lack thereof. The first one is yet again an exception. The higher the difficulty, the more projectiles Neff throws at you, and in different patterns. It makes for a more hectic and enjoyable encounter. However, in the others, there's simply not enough done to provide any form of meaningful shakeup. You can quite literally copy the tactic you used in normal, paste it in hardest, and chances are it'll work flawlessly without any need for you to adjust your approach. In my humble opinion, the beasts and difficulty modes don't do quite enough to prevent Altered Beast from being tiring. That is the game's cardinal sin, and I do think it is rightly criticized for this shortcoming. I think it could be improved by incorporating any number of the following: some form of alternate level paths, more change-ups to boss attack faces in the higher difficulties similar in degree to the first boss, more alterations in enemy level placements in hard and hardest modes, and for God's sake, let us play as the beast a little more. Heck, I'd even be fine if they cut out the warrior entirely. I'd be interested to see how they design levels around the different beasts and their abilities. As it currently stands, this is an experience that is flawed in core areas. If I had to sum up my opinion in one sentence, it would be thus: Altered Beast is a game from 1988, and it shows. Having said that, I can't turn around and tell you this is an objectively terrible game. I don't think it deserves that. Despite its significant issues, I, honest to God, at times enjoyed myself. Yeah, I can overstay its welcome pretty quick, but the game itself is short. It's only 5 stages, so it's not a massive time commitment by any means. I can see myself picking it up from time to time and doing a run or 2. Most importantly, I respect Altered Beast because it faithfully served as the gatekeeper for the Genesis for 2 years in North America and a year for the Mega Drive in Europe. It used this position to show consumers what their console could do. Many would go on to play the hell out of this thing for weeks on end, convincing them to buy more games for the system. You may not agree with everything or anything that I said here, but you can't deny that this game left its mark on its industry. Remember the movie Wreck-It Ralph? Boy, I just realized how out of left field that was. This is relevant though, I swear. Well, that right there is Neff in his final boss form, sitting at the villain round table alongside Bowser and Eggman.
Thanks, Satan.
It's 13, actually.
It's small, I know, and maybe insignificant, but I think this kind of recognition is well deserved. This has been Scott from Tilly the Lad. Thanks everyone for watching. Until next time, take care.